Hello, Andy Gavindia, and welcome back to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So today we are going to talk about advisory boards, why it's good to have one for founders, and also why it's useful for professionals to actually join a startup advisory board. But before we get there, please remind listeners about what you do.
Yes. So I am the CEO and co-founder of Riveter, and we give brands predictive insights from the images on social media. So if you're consuming it, wearing it, we can see what the trends are of people sharing in their photos, consuming drinks, wearing makeup, wearing fashion, who's sharing those photos and where they are.
Amazing. And then what do you do with those insights?
So we serve large brands, multinational, multi-brand companies to help them understand what the opportunities are for new markets, new products, and new use cases for the products that they have.
Awesome. So what are some of the companies that you've worked with?
So we worked with brands like L'Oreal to help them scope out the line of lip color that they're going to need for the next year and what the differences might be in Japan, UK, USA, helping them really target their local markets and understand their audiences.
Okay, so I've got to ask, is there a difference between the UK and the US in terms of, what people want? Because that's, really where I think our audience is, UK and US.
Yeah, there are differences between the markets. And I think within the markets too, just generationally, audience-wise, between the differences in brands that company has. So it's really helpful to be able to understand the tribes around each brand.
Okay, so what do women want in London versus women in New York? You got to tell me.
So London Gen Z women right now are doing the classic glam look, which is what I would call your look, this kind of great red lip, very classy look. In the US, it's a little bit more kind of enhanced natural, so a much more subtle lip, maybe kind of like what I'm wearing, just kind of
So
depending on the season as
literally,
well. We're representative, look at us.
we're literally representative right now. So for people who can't see this, I am wearing a red lipstick and I'm currently in London, and it is in New York with her natural lip color. Oh my God. And I'm assuming that you actually predicted that this is what would be happening 3 years ago, right?
We maybe not quite that long, but we'd have to go back and see. So we like to think that we give at least a 12 months notice. If it's a product change, at least a 24-month notice. So it does give them a lot of time to prepare their product and certainly their marketing.
Well, awesome. So I'm an advisor to Andy's company, and I think we need to have a clause in our contract that you're going to also warn me of these changes. Then I can be prepared with, the right chain. So what I want to begin with is why joining a startup advisory board is a useful thing for a professional to do, and how to basically use it to enhance your career. So what are your thoughts? Why is it useful for somebody who essentially already has a really full-time job, has a bunch of interests, and is like basically kicking ass in the world? Why add another thing?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, and I've been an advisor myself, and I've seen kind of changes in the careers of the people who have advised us, is that whatever skills that you have, whatever kind of superpowers you apply to your job, there's really that one kind of venue for them. If you can take that same set of superpowers and apply it laterally to a different industry, a different size of company, a different kind of interaction, it really helps you stretch that creativity and put a new angle on skills that you have. You don't know that they're valuable sometimes, right? Because you don't have that outside perspective when someone's really recognizing what you add to the table. And then when you bring that back into your career, you're able to articulate, here's the difference that I make. Here's actual impact that maybe in a bigger company can be hard to measure, but with a smaller company, you can see it pretty immediately.
And I also say that I personally can't just do one thing. Like I can't just kind of have fidelity to one thing. So I always kind of have the main thing. And then I would be on a board or I would be doing some sort of thing, but actually with quite a lot of intensity. So I spent some years on the University of Chicago Alumni Committee board, and that took up a lot of my time, and I really, really gave it kind of more, I think, than a lot of other people. But it was because I kind of, all this energy, it has to go somewhere. And I think when you're just giving it to one outlet, you can sort of somehow get a little bit bored, even if you actually really love your job. I'm thinking about all sorts of analogies to relationships, but we won't go there just yet. But also what I want to say to people is that if you want to work in, say, venture capital, getting an advisory board seat, that's a good way to see a startup from the inside and see product development from the inside. Because essentially, if you're actually going to be a useful venture capitalist and you are going to plan to really add value to the startup, you actually need to understand what happens inside a startup and actually offer some advice. So it's if you want to get into VC investing, then it's a good way to do that. Also, it's the same with angel investing, because generally, to get into some angel rounds with, companies that are going somewhere, it can be quite difficult. And also, even I've seen this happen when somebody has lots of money, but, that money is basically just inherited wealth, or maybe it's somebody who's married money and now they want to start investing. For founders whose companies are going somewhere, that person immediately is basically a set of red flags, because like, okay, so this person has lots of money, so they're probably going to expect to be heard. They would expect their opinions to be listened to, but they actually don't know anything about what we do, or they don't know how the startup works. And so essentially, if you can say, well, I've actually already advised startups, I'm already added some value, and here are some founders essentially who you can interview about me, then your chances of getting in to a company that potentially could make you a lot of money and could be really, really interesting are much higher. And I think finally, also, it's really useful if you want to have a career transition. So say you're working in one industry, you want to transition into another, working kind of in this part-time position can be a really good thing. But let's talk about why it's useful for founders. Why is it, why have you decided to give away some of your equity to, me and a bunch of other people? Why is this useful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to take a point that you just made, which is that being an advisor to a startup helps make you a better investor, because there are signals that you're not going to be able to see otherwise unless they're firsthand. And so the inverse is true, right? Having an advisor who's seen signals that you're not going to be able to buy in a market research report, you're not going to be able to survey potential customers for, they have that groundwork, they have that experience. And especially if you're trying to serve or work with companies that the advisor might have more familiarity with, they'll give you that inside track and say, this is not how the purchasing process works, or no, we would never pay that much, but here's who the buyer is. Like, you won't have that firsthand experience, which is really one of the biggest things. It just helps you expand the access to that information that you have.
Awesome. Okay. And now I'd really love to dive into essentially our story of how we started working together, and then what lessons people can learn from that. We met because I was running a fashion tech company at the time called NT, and we went to the same business school, Chicago Booth, but at different times. We were in different years, and we had the same entrepreneurship professor, Professor Waverly Deutsch, and she basically saw that, okay, you're working also kind of in the big data fashion tech field, although fashion is just one of your verticals. And she basically introduced us and said, you two should meet. And I remember we had this very sensible call when you were in the US, I was in London. Our two CTOs had a call. I remember my CTO really loved what you guys were doing, and he told me these people are the real deal. And then you came to London, and we met up for a business meeting to discuss working together. Do you want to take it from here?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good segue into the other thing that makes a really good founder advisor relationship, which is that you get along too, right? So we had this, as you said, very professional, very sensible dinner meeting, which turned into finishing a bottle of wine and enjoying the local scenery and the people that were part of the local scenery. And for those of you who know Sophia, you'll know that you'll learn that I'm similar, that we enjoy the same things in life. So it was a great time, and we connected on a personal level. We had a lot of things in common, having gone to the same business school, being female founders, working in tech, working in fashion, all these intersections that you just don't often find all together, right? So being able to connect on that level, and then just discovering that you're a pleasant person who you wanted to be friends with, I think makes for a good foundation to any relationship, much less an advisory one.
So okay, everybody, I'll tell you the truth. There was more than one bottle of wine and there was a really hot waiter. Um, we will leave it there. Anyway, it was a very, very fun evening. And then we became very good friends. And I think that, we advised each other and we helped each other with all sorts of entrepreneurial questions. And some of those were tactical questions, but some of those were emotional questions, like everything is falling apart. Oh my God, what am I going to do? And, this basically went on for years. And then essentially I introduced you to a client of yours, WGSN. I introduced you to them, and then you ended up, that ended up becoming quite a large part of what you were working on, one of your big customers. And again, we didn't even talk about advisory or anything, because I think that if somebody is doing something interesting and you can do something to help them, and also if it's easy for you to help them, an introduction, it can be like an email.
Yeah.
It's not the same as a kind of broker introduction. Then you kind of just do that. And then after a while, it ended up becoming a formal advisory relationship. Do you actually remember how that happened? Like how it became a formal thing?
Yes, I mean, I think you were doing such a good job about representing us and evangelizing us in its spaces that you were in. So you were going to festivals, you're going to events, you were talking about us anyway, that really it was, okay, when people look you up and when people want to see your background, having our name on your LinkedIn and being formally associated to us really helped to create that credibility on both sides from our perspective, and then also from whoever you were talking to be able to say, oh, she has an official relationship with this company. She's not just paying lip service or kind of talking about something off the top of her head. She knows kind of what's going on. And I think that's really where the evidence of all these years you were just interested in us. You just helped us anyway, and that really is the foundation for a good relationship. I think it's it's not wrong for an advisor to want to memorialize something or get some form of compensation for what they're doing, but at the same time being able to see the evidence that you were going to be an effective advisor before we signed anything was really a good way to go.
And I think this is the key with advisory positions, because I don't know about you, Andy, but I get all of these LinkedIn notifications about, will you join the advisory board of this company, or will you apply for this position to be an advisor to the startup? And I think this is terrible. Like, the founder shouldn't be doing this. This is not how you go about it. And also you as the advisor, this is not the way to go about it. And I mean, I think from what I understand, a lot of those things are on LinkedIn are kind of fundraisings in disguise, which again, like, just be honest about what you're doing. But I think for both parties, it's really important to actually, first of all, have a relationship where you get to know each other, and also that both of you have a record of delivery, because this is what's really important, I think, important for both people, because essentially as an advisor, you are giving your time and you are making enough, like, you're actually doing work. Yes, it's pleasant and it's interesting, but it is like, you're not sitting there watching Netflix with a bottle of wine. It's actual work. And you want to make sure that the work that you are doing is for a company that you think is going to go somewhere, and is also for a person whose values you're into. And equally, as a CEO, I'm sure, Andy, you have lots and lots of people who, are saying that they will add value, and you kind of just know that they weren't. And yes, you can theoretically fire people, and there are, vesting agreements, but that's never pleasant. Like, wouldn't it just be better to actually start a relationship? But tell me about your other advisors. How many other advisors do you have, Andy? Make me
So we have a few advisors. I would say probably about half a dozen, but they're all kind of specialized in particular areas. And I think also kind of depending on the scale of your company, whether you have a corporate board as well. We've used our advisory board to kind of sub out for some of those roles. So we have people who are great at fundraising. We have people who are great in our target market, which is market research, people who have the expertise in hiring and operations. And so that really helps us to kind of round out staff that we don't necessarily have or want to bat a little bit higher than our average in those areas. And that's one way to do it.
Could you go into that more? What do you mean by higher than your average?
Yeah, so kind of similarly to what made our advisor relationship work, right, is that we weren't necessarily going to these events. We didn't necessarily have the public relations background or storytelling background that you had, and so it lends us that credibility to be able to say, hey, here's someone who's really reputable in her field, and she's working with a company like Riveter. And similarly, our advisor in market research has been in the industry for a long time. He has a lot of respect there, and so it lends us the credibility, especially as a new company. If you don't have a name in the space, you get that kind of borrowed authority from your advisor too.
And also, what I really want to make sure that people get is that you said that there are advisors who cover different parts of the business. And so you are essentially making strategic choices. You are seeing where there is a need. And then you think, okay, can I fill that need myself? Sometimes you can, and sometimes you need help. And sometimes you think, actually, I really don't know how to fill that need. So I often think that, especially for non-technical founders, having somebody who's a technical advisor can be really helpful. Yes, even if you have a CTO, even if you have all of that, just having somebody who's not there in the trenches with you to just get some advice from can be super useful.
Yes, I would agree with that. And then in parallel, people who have run technology companies who are familiar with licensing agreements and contracts and service terms and those types of things that you just aren't going to encounter until they're a problem or until you're paying a large legal firm to give you that advice on the hourly rate. So it really fills that in too.
Okay, and so who was your first advice? I'm curious about this.
Oh gosh, I think officially, so we did have some kind of early participants, right, who we wanted to compensate with some shares. But officially, our first advisors were focused in finance and fundraising and had raised successfully, exited themselves, and that was a big part of us at the time. What was nice about that too is that when we first started, we thought we were going to be kind of a very traditional venture-backed SaaS company. And then after a while, quickly realized that we wanted a little bit more time to understand the market, wanted to kind of shift outside of a VC model. And thankfully, those advisors were very flexible. So as I mentioned, that kind of having run a tech company, being knowledgeable about service agreements and contracts, they flexed into that. But that's where vesting terms and having a term linked to that advisory agreement can really help. If you have an advisor whose skills exceed your needs at the time, or your needs kind of shift, being able to say, okay, we had a great relationship and now our need for an advisor relationship is over. That kind of scheduled term really helps make sure that is doable.
Okay, so let's talk about this, and then maybe we can figure out how to apply it to our personal relationships. Okay, right. So tell the audience about this, the kind of agreement that you have with your advisors.
Yes. So generally, it's good to have a consulting agreement. It just helps to protect both you and the advisor. Super great if they have an LLC, but you can do this on an individual basis. And it just says, here are the things that create for a good working relationship. And it generally will cover what this person's going to do for you, their confidentiality, what your expectations are. And then there's an advisor agreement, which covers how much they're going to be compensated. Usually it's mostly in equity, depending on kind of the nature of that relationship. They may also take a commission or something if they generate referred business for you.
And in general, what are the metrics? Like how much equity should an advisor expect?
Yeah, so there's a really good template on an advisor agreement that has a nice table in it. It's called the FAST. It's an acronym for something. I think Y Combinator has used it, but it gives kind of a table and number of hours that the advisor commits, the stage that you are as a startup. It actually generally kind of goes down because there's less risk that the advisor is taking on to advise you as a later stage startup. And then the kind of milestones. So if they're, helping you fundraise, there might be milestones in there. If they're helping you develop your business and generate referrals for you, there might be some milestones there. The highest I've seen is kind of 1% as a standard, usually vesting over the course of 1 or 2 years. But that's also flexible, right? Kind of depending on your stage and your needs and the time you're demanding from the advisor.
And so vesting, basically, for people who don't know, is that say you're going to have 1%, and maybe it's over, say, 2 years, because I think 2 years for advisors is standard, right?
Yes.
So that means that you don't get it straight away, that you basically get it at the end of the 2 years. And the logic there is that, for example, if I had been doing all these amazing things, talking about Rivet, introducing you to clients and all of these things, but then the moment I became an advisor, I was like, I fooled you. That's it. You're getting nothing else from me. And I did nothing ever again. Like, it wouldn't be particularly fair for me to just then get everything straight away. And so this is why you have vesting, that essentially you get a little bit of what you were promised every few months. And then at the end of the year, at the end of the period, at the end of the 2 years, you will get the whole thing, as long as you have actually been performing. And so founders and founding teams and basically other people have equity in your company, unless they've actually paid for it, unless they're an investor, everybody has to have a vesting period. And then, am I right that you were saying that essentially if an advisor has expertise in a field that you no longer need, you can essentially say, well, thank you very much. You've vested, say, half of your shares, but since we don't need you anymore, you're not going to get the other half.
Yeah, I think generally you wouldn't kind of terminate an agreement unless there was a really good reason for it. But I think that's where having a length of term of, let's try this out for a year and then, kind of see if we want to renew it. That's where that protection comes in. And it also helps the advisor as well, right? If things change in their life, they have different needs themselves, they have different time commitments that they need to kind of reallocate for. And it really aligns the incentives too, right? So you're hoping, you're trying to see this equity grow during the time that you're being granted it, and as it grows and you grow your share of it, helps keep those things mutually beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, alignment of interest, I think it's important with investors, and also I think especially advisors, because, there you are, you're working your butt off. But imagine that there is somebody who has, and actually I've seen this happen. So somebody has exited their company and they're used to working really, really hard. And I actually think of one person in particular. They exited their company and basically they just went on a wild adventure. They worked really hard, then they got the millions, and then it was like Vegas, all the things. Wait, and I'm not going to blame them. I would do the same thing. But let's just say that they were a little bit distracted. And so it would be unfair to essentially, keep that person on the same vesting schedule, because they're actually not turning up because, they're having all sorts of fun. And so life happens, things change, and especially with advisors, when essentially somebody is now an exited startup founder and they've decided that they're going to live on their yacht without connection, it's really difficult to get hold of them. Okay, so now what I'd love to cover is what makes a good advisor, and let's explain that by showing what makes a bad advisor. And so what are the things not to do? So what's your thing number one that advisors shouldn't do?
Oh man, I think, having seen this, thankfully not firsthand through advisory experience, but having seen this through, testing out accelerators or talking to potential advisors, you get a lot of, shall we say, unqualified advice that's very generic and definitely may not apply to your business. So there's a lot of conventional wisdom around SaaS startups, right? And it's very easy to share that conventional wisdom without really understanding what is the nature of this business. Is their target market different? Is their core technology different? How's the team? So number one is ask questions as an advisor first before spouting that advice. And it's tempting, right? You want to show that you have value, you want to show that you have knowledge, but general advice doesn't help anyone because they can access that for free elsewhere.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say this about accelerators, because I see this especially with corporate accelerators, where you essentially have a bunch of people who are from that corporate, and then they're advising a startup. And I think, well, okay, well, what do you actually know about startup innovation? Like, if you've just read a bunch of TechCrunch articles, we've probably read the same TechCrunch articles. So, thank you very much. So, and here I would say that even if you're working in a corporate and you want to be a startup advisor, you totally can be, because, for example, if you have expertise in how that startup could get a contract with a corporate, maybe with your corporate or with a corporate, with another one in the field. That is super useful knowledge. Like that is wonderful knowledge. The startup is really, really thirsty for that. But if it's kind of general strategic stuff that you've read in a book, that is not going to count.
Yes, 100%. And it goes back to that lived experience, right? So just as you said, if you're helping someone navigate how to work with purchasing, like here's how to frame the story, here's how to compare the costs, here's the actual example of a document that we would need to get you through. That's not stuff that's going to come through the founder's expertise, which is testing the market and seeing if there's an appetite for it and understanding needs. And that's kind of where the division of labor makes the most sense. You don't want either person focusing on the other thing necessarily, because that's where their skills are and where their talents are going to be best used.
So I guess from that also, this is where getting to know the founder in the first place is actually a really, really useful thing, because then you get to know what their problems are, and then you can actually then see where your expertise is a good fit, as opposed to just kind of randomly spouting things. Another thing I think is this ability to kind of, offer your point of view, but then if the CEO decides not to take it, then leave it, because it's their company. Even if you think that their choice is the wrong choice, it is their choice. And, I think it's probably must be really difficult for parents, because it's like, like when parents just want to basically say, no, 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 do this thing as opposed to the other thing. I think kind of advisors have the same issues, like, no, but I told you should do this. But actually, if you said it once, if your advice has been acknowledged, so you know that they've heard it, you know that they've understood it, and they've decided not to follow it, you just have to accept it.
Yeah,
because it's not your business.
You can't take it personally, and I think that's one of the things I appreciate about you. And it's not that I'm not going to take the advice to invest in our marketing, because I 100% agree that it's an important and that it will generate dividends and returns. But I think having that empathy that you have, and having been a founder yourself, of knowing, okay, well, there are priorities and there's a time constraint, and how do we kind of think about the resources that we have. And so it helps me so much to know that you're not going to take it personally if I'm not just immediately taking all the action items that you suggest, but that I am considering them and trying to put them in the right time and place.
Maybe I do take it personally, I just don't show it.
There you
That's
go.
the key. That's the key. So you've got half a dozen advisors now. That's already like quite a lot of people. Are you planning to add more as the company changes? Or is like, have you thought that, okay, I need to have a certain, like a finite number, or not? And the reason I'm asking is because there's such a different approach. I think the founder of DocuSign, I'm pretty sure it's DocuSign, he has taken it to an absolutely extreme level where they have like, I think hundreds upon hundreds of advisors, and they literally have this like annual advisor gathering, which is sort of like they all get together and they have press releases and parties. It's like this massive party. And so he has used advisory relationships really very much like brand ambassadors. So for people who are interested in this, look up that case study, because it is an extreme and it's interesting. But I find most people don't do that. Most people are essentially, have enough advice that you can count on both hands. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's definitely an overhead to it. Not that it's not a good investment, but there's a capacity constraint as well, right? So if you think about all the good advice you're giving me that I just don't have time to take at the same time, multiply that by 6, and then you kind of get that multiple factor. And ideally, you're structuring it in such a way that your business is evolving as you're getting this advice. So your needs should change, and it won't make sense to have the same advisor on board for forever. And you won't necessarily need advisors to fill those gaps anymore. So once you reach a certain level of credibility in the marketplace, or once you understand a certain set of users better, you should kind of graduate out of that, which is not to say that, it can't be a useful play. Like in the DocuSign case, it probably helped them to just have those people have an invested stake in the company and to be customers and referrals. But it does add, just as having investors adds a lot of work, making sure that you have the priorities and the time to address that in a good way.
Oh, and actually, sorry, just one more thing. I wonder, do you have thoughts on essentially how often you expect to speak to advisors and how much you expect them to do? And I know that in our case, it might be a little bit different because we're friends and we speak to each other anyway. And I think our conversations are like, well, let's talk about what's happening in life and then business. Like there is no separation. But I would imagine that with other advisors, it's probably a little bit more formal. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, I would say generally having meetings on the calendar, so having a regular kind of call cadence and update cadence is good. Probably at least monthly, if not bi-weekly, depending on how that relationship is and how much frequently things are changing. Some of them might be seasonal things. So if you're fundraising during a certain time of year, you're going to really kind of enact some of those or activate some of those advisors much more during that time, and maybe it'll kind of be a slower update. But having a schedule, documenting the expectations and saying like, here's how many hours a week I may be asking from you, or how many referrals, or how many emails, or how much input. And it could be stage based as well. So if we're releasing a new version of the product and I have people who are weighing in specifically on features, being able to say, here's the calendar for that and the expectation of time that we're asking from the advisor.
So there has to be some sort of formalization to it. And, so this kind of brings me to this point that, and I don't know what the answer is here. Is it a good idea to have your friends on your advisory board or not? I don't know. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is that I really want people to see that actually the way Andy and I came into each other's lives was first a professional relationship. So yes, it then developed into a friendship, but I think that if you meet each other in a kind of professional way, and that's how you start, essentially that's always there. Whereas I think it is completely different from somebody who, maybe you went to school with, you went to high school with, and then you grow up together and then they start a company, because then that relationship more resembles family. And because it didn't have those professional kind of gradations in the first place, it might be more difficult to say, hey, okay, I know that you've fallen in love, it's all amazing, but you haven't done anything for the company. Okay, your vesting period has to end. I would imagine that with somebody who you started your relationship with in a professional way, that conversation is still not going to be pleasant, but it's going to flow much easier than with somebody who is essentially sort of like, your sister from another mister. What are your thoughts? Friends and advisor relationships.
Yeah, I think it definitely would add to the complexity, just because there is one of the things we touched on earlier was taking advice, and if it's not taken, not taking it personally. I think as friends, we know what it's like to give advice to friends and have them not listen to it too, and it can certainly change the dynamic of it. And then also just like we talked about the scheduling and putting an aspect of formality into it. So if you don't have a relationship with that friend where you're putting meetings on their calendar, it's going to be a bit of a transition in and out. So I think the principles apply to working with friends and hiring friends or working for friends in the same way, is that it does change the relationship fundamentally. If you've had success with it in the past, maybe you can pull it off, but there's already so much complexity. There are already so many emotional factors in running a company you don't necessarily want anymore.
Yes, exactly. Well, is there anything else that you would like people to know, either people who would be advisors or people who are founders who are thinking, okay, I need to get an advisory board. How do I go about it? Any final parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would say you get what you give, right? So if I can't bring good questions or priorities or needs to my advisors, I can't expect them to just come up with magical solutions for me. And so as a founder, even just recognizing, where do you have those gaps, where do you have those needs before an advisor comes to you, to be able to say, is this going to be a good match for where we are right now? And being able to have that trust with that person of saying, these are my needs. This is kind of where my focus is. Getting them to weigh in is really the most important ingredient to all of it.
And you know what? I actually noticed that in terms of my coaching clients too, because the people who are more prepared, like, okay, I'm meeting with Sophia, I'm going to have the session. These are the things that I am struggling with. This is what I want to cover. That I think generally tends to work better. And sometimes literally the question is, I don't know what to focus on because there's all of this going on. I've got so many fires. That is still a question. The question of there are 10 things that are all an emergency and I have to pick one to deal with. What am I doing? That's still a question, as opposed to, okay, well, I'm just going to switch on the Zoom and see what happens.
I think that reminds me of probably one of my favorite moments of having you as an advisor, and something that I'll always remember is that I came to you even just more as a friend in crisis because of an issue with our biggest customer and potentially losing their business. And I just remember saying to you, I can't even think right now, right? I'm in crisis mode, I'm stressed. And you just had this great, okay, let's add some perspective to this. Let's think about what this actually could mean for the business. Let's look at tasks that you can do. Let's think about this in relation to the wider industry and kind of what's going on for that person's or that company's business. And I just remember feeling completely transformed at the end of that conversation, just way better. All that stress was lifted. It didn't change the situation, but it helped give me a new perspective on it. And so I think that, aside from all of the practical reasons that we've talked about today, having that perspective and having that support and someone who's in your corner can just make your life better too.
I remember that day. It was raining and we had brownies. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. It has been wonderful having you here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the listeners about how you're going to use this podcast, either to get an advisory position or to get some really, really good advisors on your advisory board and use them correctly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia.